Beneath your feet lies a forgotten blueprint for civilization itself. The first farmers did not just plant seeds. They followed a sophisticated, unwritten code that transformed humanity forever. By the end of this journey, you will understand the hidden rules that built our world and why they are critically relevant today. How did ancient societies read the stars to know when to plant? What secret pact did they make with the animals they domesticated? We will uncover the profound wisdom embedded in their daily lives. What part of our modern world do you think is most shaped by these ancient choices? That single act of saving a seed was a declaration of intent. It was a human being looking at a wild plant and deciding, this one will grow where I choose. This was the spark of domestication, a new partnership with nature that would rewrite our entire story. This was not a sudden revolution in the way we think of one today. It was a slow, patient dance of trial and error that unfolded over generations. In a few key regions around the globe, most famously the Fertile Crescent, our ancestors began a grand experiment. They noticed that some stands of wild wheat held onto their seeds better than others. These were the plants they would harvest. These were the seeds they would save and sow. Without knowing the science of genetics, they were selectively breeding for a better crop. They did the same with animals. The less aggressive wild goats, the sheep that were easier to handle, these were the ones they favored, the ones they allowed to breed. This was the first unwritten rule of the farmer's code: observation and adaptation. It was about reading the land and the life upon it with profound attention, then having the patience to nudge that life in a new direction. This foundational bond with the land did more than just provide a steady food supply. It rewired the human mind itself. For the first time, people were investing in tomorrow, next season, next year. Their entire sense of time and their place in the world shifted from a daily hunt to an annual cycle of planning and nurturing. This new relationship with nature set into motion forces that would build villages, then cities, and ultimately, the world we inhabit today. This new sense of time demanded a new kind of clock, one built not from gears but from the sky itself. The first farmers became the first astronomers, their eyes fixed on the heavens to read the rhythms of the earth. They watched the moon patiently, marking its journey from a thin sliver to a glowing orb and back again. These lunar cycles gave them the first calendars, a way to measure the passage of weeks and months. But the moon alone was not enough to dictate the life of a seed. For that, they needed the sun. They tracked its path across the horizon, noting how it shifted north in the summer and south in the winter. The precise point where the sun rose on the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, became a critical marker. This was the signal that the dry season was ending or the rains were soon to begin. It was time to prepare the soil. We can still see the echoes of this ancient science in monuments like Stonehenge. Those massive stones are not just a mysterious circle. They are a sophisticated agricultural calendar, aligned so the rising sun on the solstice shines directly through the heart of the structure, announcing a turning point in the year to the entire community. This knowledge was far too important to be written in a book that few could read. Instead, it was woven into the very fabric of their culture. The constellations that appeared at certain times of year became characters in myths and legends. The story of a hero in the stars might signal the coming of the planting season. Rituals and festivals were timed to the phases of the moon, creating a communal rhythm that everyone, from the eldest elder to the youngest child, could feel and follow. This was the second hidden rule of the farmer's code, a profound harmony with natural cycles. Their survival depended on planting at the exact right moment, not a week too early or a day too late. They had to become masters of celestial timing, reading the cosmic cues to ensure their crops would thrive. This deep connection to the environment was a form of wisdom we have largely forgotten, a silent conversation with the universe that guided their hand. This new relationship with time and the land reshaped human relationships as well. Picture a small Neolithic village, a cluster of homes nestled near its fields. For the first time, people were bound to a place and to each other by the shared labor of farming. Tilling the soil, planting the seeds, and harvesting the grain were tasks too large for one family alone. This demanded cooperation on a scale never before seen, forging a new social contract built around shared work and shared land. Out of this necessity, the first formal roles and rules were born. Someone had to coordinate the planting, to decide when the communal harvest would begin, and to manage the distribution of the food. This was the seed of leadership. A revolutionary change occurred when these early farms produced more food than the village needed for immediate survival. This surplus was a profound turning point. For the first time, not every person had to spend every day searching for food. This abundance allowed for specialization. One person could become exceptionally skilled at making pottery to store the grain. Another could dedicate themselves to weaving textiles or to crafting better tools, and another could focus entirely on organizing the community, on settling disputes, or on leading rituals to ensure a good harvest. This division of labor created new social layers, a distinction between those who worked the land, those who crafted goods, and those who guided the people. With a permanent home and a lasting investment in the land, the very concept of ownership transformed. Land was no longer a temporary territory to be hunted over, but a valuable asset to be maintained and passed down. This created a new set of hidden rules, unspoken codes governing inheritance and access. In many early societies, like those in ancient Mesopotamia, the best land often became associated with certain families, those who were perhaps seen as closer to the leaders or the gods. Rules were established that favored these groups, ensuring their control over the most productive fields generation after generation. This was the great double-edged sword of the agricultural revolution. The same cooperation that built villages and fostered amazing new skills also built the foundations of social inequality. The shift from a nomadic band, where sharing was essential for daily survival, to a settled society created a new divide between the powerful and the common, the land rich and the land poor. Fairness and favoritism were both woven into the fabric of this new way of life. The social dynamics born in these first farming villages, this intricate balance between community cohesion and emerging hierarchy, would eventually pave the way for the rise of kings, priests, and the complex civilizations that followed. But this new social structure also created a new kind of vulnerability, one that reached deep into the very soil they depended on. This mastery over the social landscape was matched by an even greater conquest of the physical world. The ability to command water itself became the next great leap in the farmer's code. In the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia and along the life-giving Nile, the first farmers faced a paradox. They had the fertile soil and the knowledge to grow crops, but they lacked one essential element: reliable water. Their survival now depended on solving this puzzle, on bringing water from the river to the field. The earliest solution was beautifully simple: a shallow ditch dug by hand to guide a trickle of river water to a thirsty patch of grain. This was the humble beginning of irrigation, a technology that would grow in complexity to rival the greatest monuments. Over generations, these simple ditches evolved into vast, branching networks of canals that stretched for miles. The farmers of the Indus Valley, for instance, engineered entire cities around sophisticated water management, with channels that distributed the river's gift with breathtaking precision. These were not random excavations, they were feats of collective imagination and effort, designed to use the gentle, relentless pull of gravity to do the work. Water would flow from the main river into primary canals, then into smaller channels, and finally into the fields themselves, all without a single pump, guided only by the careful slope of the land. This level of coordination demanded something profound from the community. It required a shared plan and a shared commitment to maintenance. Every member of the village had a stake in keeping the channels clear of silt and debris. This annual or seasonal labor was more than just chores. It was a ritual that reinforced their social bonds, a tangible reminder that their individual survival was inextricably linked to the well-being of the whole. With this shared resource, however, came the need for new rules, the first codes of water law. How would the water be divided when the river ran low? Who had the right to the first share? Communities developed intricate local agreements to prevent conflicts. A farmer at the far end of the canal network needed a guarantee that his field would also receive its life-giving share, ensuring that no single family could hoard the water for themselves. This was the hidden rule of equitable distribution, a pioneering concept of resource sharing that recognized water as a common good, not a private possession. Through this hydraulic ingenuity, the first farmers did more than just water their crops. They transformed scarcity into abundance, teaching themselves, and ultimately us, the critical lessons of environmental stewardship and collective responsibility. Their greatest achievement was not the water they moved, but the social contracts they forged to move it. And from this very soil, watered by cooperation and conflict, a new form of power began to grow. This careful selection of seeds was a quiet revolution in itself. Long before we had the language of genetics, these first farmers were acting as intuitive bioengineers. Their most vital library was not built of clay tablets or parchment, but of living, breathing seeds, carefully saved from one harvest to sow the next. Each season, they faced a critical choice: which plants would provide the seeds for the future. They did not choose randomly, they observed with a hunter's sharp eye. They selected the seeds from the plants that stood tallest, that resisted a blight, that held their grains tight against the wind, or that simply produced the most. This was a slow, cumulative form of wisdom, a knowledge passed from parent to child not through written manuals, but through the shared work of the harvest. Over countless generations, this relentless selection gave rise to what we now call landraces. These were not uniform crops bred in a lab. They were unique, locally adapted families of plants. A maize variety grown in a dry mountain valley would develop deep roots and tough leaves, while the same crop in a humid coastal region might be selected for its resistance to mold. This created a breathtaking tapestry of agricultural diversity, a distributed safety net for humanity. If a new pest swept through one valley, the unique landrace in the next valley might possess a natural resistance, ensuring that the food supply as a whole would endure. The preservation of thousands of heirloom maize varieties across the Americas stands as a powerful testament to this system. Each colorful kernel was a chapter in a long story of survival, a specific solution to a local challenge encoded in the plant's very DNA. This practice embodied a profound hidden rule that diversity is not a luxury but the fundamental key to resilience. These farmers were stewards of a living legacy, curators of a biological library that held the solutions to problems they could not yet foresee. Their greatest insight was understanding that the future of their children depended on the choices they made with a single handful of seeds. And just as they learned to cultivate the land, they also learned to cultivate something even more powerful: the bonds of community and trade. Every seed planted was also a prayer. The profound uncertainty of farming, the ever-present threat of drought or pestilence, forged a deep spiritual bond between the first farmers and the forces of nature. They saw the miracle of a tiny seed transforming into a life-sustaining plant as something beyond mere mechanics. It was a sacred cycle of death and rebirth, a process that demanded not just labor but reverence. This is why agricultural life became so deeply intertwined with religious belief. Communities developed elaborate rituals to sanctify the entire growing cycle. Before the first seed was sown, priests or elders might lead a ceremony to bless the fields, often making offerings to appease the spirits of the earth. The entire village would participate, their collective hopes focused on the soil beneath their feet. This was not superstition. It was a powerful psychological tool, a way for a community to confront its collective anxiety about the future and feel a sense of control over the uncontrollable. In ancient Egypt, the people worshipped Osiris, the god of the afterlife and regeneration. His story mirrored the agricultural year. He was killed and dismembered, only to be reborn, just as the seed must die in the ground to bring forth new life. By honoring Osiris, the farmers were aligning their work with the fundamental rhythm of the universe, seeking his divine favor for the annual flooding of the Nile and the fertility of their fields. Similarly, in Greece, the goddess Demeter presided over the harvest. The myth of her daughter Persephone's annual descent into the underworld explained the very seasons themselves. Her grief during her daughter's absence brought winter, and her joy upon Persephone's return caused the earth to bloom once more. These were not just stories. They were the foundational narratives that gave meaning to the hard, uncertain work of farming. The great festivals that marked the planting and the harvest were vital community events. They reinforced social cohesion, reminding everyone that they were part of a single, interconnected organism whose survival depended on shared faith and shared effort. The harvest Thanksgiving was not merely a celebration of abundance. It was a crucial act of gratitude, a recognition that their success was not solely their own doing. Hidden within these rituals was a critical rule of the farmer's code, a rule of profound respect. It taught that the earth was not just a resource to be exploited, but a living partner in a sacred covenant. You took life from the soil, and in return, you honored it with your labor, your offerings, and your faith. This spiritual dimension transformed farming from a mere occupation into a holistic way of life, weaving together the practical, the social, and the divine into a single, enduring tapestry. And as this tapestry grew more complex, another powerful force began to weave its own threads into the pattern, the universal language of exchange and value. The same reverence for the earth that inspired their rituals found physical form in the very shape of the land itself. In the high Andes, ancient farmers looked upon steep, seemingly impossible mountain slopes and did not see a barrier. They saw potential. With immense patience and collective effort, they carved the mountains into a series of vast, ascending steps, creating flat terraces where only angled rock and thin soil had existed before. This was the art of terracing, a monumental act of landscape engineering that turned erosion into creation. Each stone-retaining wall did more than just hold back the earth. It was a line of defense against the relentless pull of gravity and water. When rains fell on the steep mountains, instead of washing the precious topsoil down into the valleys, the water was captured and slowed. It would seep gently into the terraced field, hydrating the crops and depositing nutrients rather than stealing them away. The Incas of South America perfected this system, building terraces that climbed thousands of feet into the sky. These were not just gardens, they were the foundation of an empire, supporting large populations in places where conventional farming would have been unthinkable. The terraces created a multitude of microclimates. A crop that struggled in the warmer valley might thrive on a cooler, sun-drenched terrace higher up the mountain, a brilliant form of natural risk management. But building the terraces was only the first step. The true hidden rule was in how they maintained the life of the soil within them. These farmers understood that the land could not be relentlessly taxed without being replenished. They developed sophisticated cycles of crop rotation, planting different foods in a field each season. A crop that took nitrogen from the soil one year might be followed by a crop, like certain beans, that could help return it. In other years, a field might be left completely fallow, allowed to rest and regain its strength. This practice of fallowing was an act of long-term investment, a sacrifice of one season's yield to ensure the health of the land for future generations. It was a quiet agreement with the earth, a promise that they would not take more than it could sustainably give. This deep ecological wisdom, this commitment to working with the geography rather than fighting it, stands in stark contrast to the exploitative methods that would emerge later. The terraces of the Andes, the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, they all whisper the same fundamental principle. True abundance comes from understanding the rules of the land and nurturing its capacity for life. This ancient pact of stewardship raises a vital question for our own time. What happens when that pact is broken, when the accumulated wisdom of generations is lost? That extra bag of grain in the storehouse was more than just food. It was a new kind of power. For the first time, a family or a village possessed something they did not immediately need to consume. This simple surplus of wheat, barley, or millet became the world's first true currency, sparking an economic revolution that would reshape human society. A farmer with a surplus of grain could now approach the village potter and propose a trade, a measure of grain for a set of sturdy storage jars. The potter, freed from the need to grow their own food, could perfect their craft, creating vessels that were not just functional but beautiful. This was the birth of specialization. The same logic applied to the toolmaker, the weaver, and the emerging class of leaders and priests. Each could dedicate their life to a specific skill because the farmer's surplus reliably fed them. But this new system of barter demanded its own set of hidden rules. How many pots was a bag of grain worth? How many chickens equaled a new sickle? Communities had to develop a shared sense of value, establishing informal exchange rates for their most important commodities. In ancient Sumer, we see this system codified on a grand scale. The great temple complexes acted as the central banks of their day. Farmers would bring their surplus grain to the temple, which stored it in massive granaries. The temple then used this collective surplus to feed specialized workers, from scribes and administrators to soldiers and construction crews, all while redistributing food during lean times. This economic shift wove a web of interdependence that stretched far beyond a single village. A community rich in obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, could trade it with a distant village that had surplus grain or salt. These trade routes became conduits for more than just goods. They carried new ideas, technologies, and even languages, connecting once isolated groups into a wider network of human culture. The ability to generate a surplus and trade it fairly was a cornerstone of the agricultural code. It transformed humanity from a collection of self-sufficient family groups into a complex, interconnected civilization where progress was no longer just about survival, but about the collective advancement of all. This new economic reality, however, created a new kind of record, one that would permanently change how humans communicated across time and space. The first shepherd did not simply control the flock, but walked with it. This was a new kind of relationship, a living pact forged not in domination, but in mutual dependence. the early farmers who domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats entered into an unspoken agreement with these beasts. In return for milk, meat, wool, and their immense labor, humanity offered something precious in the ancient world: protection. A goat herder did not just guard his animals from wolves. He guided them to the best pastures, ensured they had water, and sheltered the young and the weak. This was the hidden rule of stewardship, a code of care that recognized the herd's well-being was directly tied to the family's survival. Selective breeding was its most powerful tool. Without understanding genetics, these herders made careful choices. They favored the cow that gave the most milk, the sheep with the thickest wool, the ox that was strongest and most placid. Over generations, this patient selection sculpted the animals themselves, creating lineages perfectly suited to human needs and local environments. This wisdom was often guarded by ritual. In many cultures, specific songs or ceremonies were believed to protect the herds from disease, and certain practices, like never slaughtering a nursing mother, were followed as sacred rules. These were not just superstitions. They were cultural mechanisms that enforced sustainable practices, ensuring the long-term health of the herd. We can see this balanced relationship perfected by the nomadic pastoralists of Central Asia. Their entire way of life was a delicate dance with the land. They did not simply wander. They followed ancient cyclical routes, moving their herds to highland pastures in the summer and back to the sheltered valleys in the winter. This mobility was a form of natural pasture management. It allowed grazed lands to recover, preventing overgrazing and soil depletion. The herds fertilized the land as they moved, and in return, the land provided a constant, renewable supply of forage. This was a profound understanding of ecological balance, a pact that honored the rhythms of the earth. The ethics of animal care were a silent, yet foundational part of the agricultural code. A healthy, thriving herd was a testament to a family's wisdom and virtue. It was a relationship built on a daily routine of provision and respect, a far cry from the mere exploitation of a resource. This ancient bond between the keeper and the kept wove another essential thread into the fabric of civilization, one that would soon find its permanent expression in marks of ownership and records of wealth. Leaving a field empty was an act of profound wisdom. It seemed like a waste, a plot of good land producing nothing for an entire season. But the first farmers understood something we are only now relearning, that the land, like any living thing, needs to rest. This practice, known as fallowing, was the earliest and most fundamental rule of long-term soil care. It was a sacrifice of immediate gain for the health of generations to come. They observed that after a few years of planting the same crop, the yields would begin to fall. The soil grew tired, its vitality spent. By letting a field lie fallow, they were allowing nature to do its work. Weeds would grow, die, and decompose, returning organic matter to the earth. Earthworms and microbes would thrive, aerating the soil and rebuilding its structure. The land was not being neglected, it was being actively restored. From this simple beginning grew an even more sophisticated practice: crop rotation. This was not a random change of crops. It was a precise, hidden language spoken between the farmer and the soil, a language learned over countless seasons of careful observation. They discovered that different plants took different things from the earth, and some even gave something back. The most brilliant example is the legume, plants like peas, beans, and lentils. Ancient farmers noticed that fields where these plants grew seemed to be more fertile afterward. They did not have the word nitrogen, but they saw the result. Legumes, through a miraculous symbiosis with bacteria in their root nodules, pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil, effectively creating their own fertilizer. Planting legumes after a grain crop like wheat or barley was like settling a debt with the land. This wisdom was codified in systems like the three-field rotation of medieval Europe. A village's farmland would be divided into three large sections. One section would be planted with a winter grain like rye or wheat. A second section would be planted with a spring crop, often a legume like peas or beans. The third section would be left fallow. The following year, the crops would rotate. The fallow field would be planted with the winter grain. The grain field would get the spring legumes, and the legume field would get its turn to rest. This created a sustainable cycle that prevented total soil exhaustion, diversified the food supply, and supported larger populations. This knowledge was not locked away in a book. It was a communal treasure passed down through songs, proverbs, and the rhythm of daily work. An elder would show a child how the soil felt after beans, or how the wheat grew stronger where the sheep had been penned the year before. This was a science of place, a deep, localized understanding of a specific patch of earth. It taught a lesson far beyond farming, the value of patience and foresight. You could not cheat the cycle. You could not force the land to give more than it had. The hidden rule here was one of reciprocity, a give and take that ensured the balance of the whole system. In our modern world of instant results, this ancient practice speaks directly to our greatest challenges. The timeless truth of rotation and rest reminds us that true sustainability is not about extraction, but about renewal, a conversation with the earth that has been going on for 10,000 years. The shared well could only be dug once, and the harvest required every hand. This simple truth forced the first farming communities to invent something entirely new, a system of governance. In every village, a council would form, often the most experienced elders who remembered the great drought or the plague of locusts. Their authority did not come from force, but from a deep reservoir of collective trust and shared necessity. Their most vital role was to serve as living judges for the conflicts that farming life inevitably created. When two families argued over whose turn it was to use the water from a canal, the council would hear both sides and render a judgment based on custom and fairness. They decided when the communal harvest would begin, a critical decision that affected the entire year's food supply. If one farmer harvested too early, he might damage the unripe crops of his neighbors. If he waited too long, a sudden storm could destroy everything. This required a single, unified decision for the good of all. These councils were the first legislatures, crafting the unwritten laws of agriculture. They established norms for dealing with blight, dictating that a field with a spreading sickness should be quarantined to protect the others. They managed the complex rules of shared labor, ensuring that every family contributed to maintaining the irrigation ditches or building the communal granary. In ancient India, this system was known as the Gram Panchayat, a village assembly that managed local affairs for millennia. In the city-states of Mesopotamia, the temple council not only stored the grain surplus, but also adjudicated land disputes and organized large-scale irrigation projects. The hidden principle at work here was a radical one for its time, the idea that the community's survival was more important than any single person's ambition. Decisions were often made through consensus, a slow and deliberate process of discussion until a general agreement was reached. This was not mere efficiency, it was a profound exercise in mutual accountability. Every member of the village understood that their own well-being was tied to the health of the whole. The success of the harvest depended as much on this social contract as it did on the rain and the sun. These early councils demonstrate that agriculture did not just teach us how to grow food, it taught us how to live together, forging the first blueprints for justice, order, and collective responsibility from the very soil we cultivated. The harvest was not just a human achievement, it was a divine drama. Across the ancient world, the terrifying uncertainty of farming was given a face and a story, transforming the life-death rebirth cycle of the crops into the epic struggles of gods and goddesses. The Sumerian goddess Inanna did not simply preside over fertility. She personally descended into the underworld, died, and was reborn, her return to the world above mirroring the miraculous return of life to the fields each spring. Her story was not mere entertainment. It was a sacred map of the agricultural year, encoding the hidden rule that life is always purchased with a period of darkness and sacrifice. In Rome, the goddess Ceres was the literal heart of the cereal harvest. Her grief over her daughter Proserpina's abduction explained the barrenness of winter, and her joy upon their reunion each year brought the burst of growth. These narratives were the operating system of early agriculture, providing a spiritual framework for every practical action. A farmer sowing a seed was reenacting the myth of the dying and returning god, participating in a cosmic event. This connection infused back-breaking labor with profound purpose. The rituals derived from these myths were precise guides to moral and practical conduct. A planting ceremony dedicated to Ceres was not just a prayer for rain, it was a communal recommitment to the values of hard work, patience, and respect for the earth's limits. These stories often reflected and reinforced the gender roles inherent in early farming societies. Goddesses of the earth and fertility were frequently depicted as the source of all life, the womb from which the crops emerged, aligning with women's foundational role in seed selection and plant domestication. Gods of the storm and the sun, like the Hittite Tahun or the Greek Zeus, were the external forces that acted upon the earth, their favor won through ritual and sacrifice. This divine division of labor mirrored the human one, sanctifying the different but interconnected contributions of men and women to the community's survival. The deepest lesson woven into these myths was one of sacred interdependence. The gods were not distant rulers, they were partners in the work of creation. The earth was not inert dirt, it was a living, breathing entity, a goddess to be honored, not a resource to be mined. To take a harvest without giving thanks in ritual was an act of hubris, a violation of the cosmic balance. This mythological layer was the soul of the farmer's code, a constant reminder that their survival was woven into a much larger, sacred story. It was this spiritual dimension that transformed a simple methodology for growing food into a holistic way of being, one that would ultimately find its most concrete expression in the very structures they built to manage their newfound wealth. A surplus of grain was a promise of tomorrow, but only if it could be made to last. This challenge sparked a revolution in architecture and foresight, one that moved food security from the field into a carefully constructed space. The first granaries were humble pits dug into the earth, lined with straw or clay to create a sealed environment where grain could be protected from the elements. But as harvests grew, so did the ambition of storage. Communities began to build above ground, raising granaries on stone pillars or wooden stilts. This was not merely for show. Elevating the grain created a critical barrier against ground moisture and against pests like rats and insects, who now found the bounty frustratingly out of reach. The design of these structures became a science in itself. Walls were woven from reeds or timber to allow for a constant, gentle flow of air, a natural ventilation system that prevented the buildup of heat and mold, the silent killers of any stored harvest. In ancient Rome, these warehouses were known as horia, and they were the logistical backbone of the empire. A Roman horium was a fortress of food, its very presence in a city a powerful symbol of public order and imperial stability. To control the grain supply was to hold the loyalty of the people. This architectural leap required a parallel revolution in social trust. a communal granary was a tangible representation of the village's collective future. Its security could not depend on one family. Elaborate systems of oversight emerged, often managed by the village council. Multiple people might hold keys, or guards would be posted during the most vulnerable times after the harvest. The hidden rule here was one of transparent stewardship. Everyone needed to trust that the grain was being counted accurately and distributed fairly, especially when the lean months of winter arrived. This gave rise to the world's first inventory systems, marks on clay tokens, notches on a tally stick. These were the early ledgers used to track how much grain each family had contributed and what they were entitled to withdraw. It was a primitive but effective form of accounting, a system built on the fundamental principle that for the community to survive, resources had to be managed with scrupulous honesty. The very existence of these granaries transformed the human relationship with time itself. No longer were people trapped in a desperate cycle of hand-to-mouth existence. With a year's supply of food safely in storage, they could plan, they could invest, they could dream. The granary was the physical manifestation of the farmer's code, a declaration that humanity would no longer be a passive victim of the seasons, but an active architect of its own future. While the granaries secured the harvest, it was the daily, intimate labor of women that filled them. For generations, our image of the first farmer has been a male figure, but the archaeological record tells a different, more nuanced story. In countless early societies, women were the primary cultivators, the true botanists of their time. Their deep, generational knowledge of plants, born from their traditional roles as gatherers, formed the bedrock of the agricultural revolution. They were the ones who could distinguish a poisonous root from an edible tuber, who knew which wild grasses held the most grain, and who understood the subtle signs that a plant was ready for harvest. This was not a side project, it was the central pillar of community survival. Their patient observation and experimentation with seeds, their careful selection for the best traits, this was the very engine of domestication. While men may have cleared the fields, it was often women who owned the plots, who decided what to plant and when, and who managed the complex cycle from sowing to storing. Their hands were the first to cradle the seeds that would become our wheat, our rice, and our corn. This expertise created a hidden rule of the farmer's code, one where authority was derived not from physical strength, but from an irreplaceable knowledge of life itself. This specialized knowledge extended far beyond the field. The hard, practical work of turning raw grain into edible food fell largely to women, and in solving this problem, they became our first engineers. The invention of grinding stones was a monumental leap. A simple saddle quern, a stone base with a handheld rock used to crush grain, transformed inedible husks into nourishing flour. This was not a one-time task, but a daily ritual that required immense effort and skill. Later, the creation of pottery, a technology often attributed to women, provided the essential vessels for storing that flour, for cooking porridge, and for brewing the first beers. These were not just domestic chores, they were fundamental technological advancements that made sedentary life possible. You could not build a village, let alone a city, if you could not reliably process and store your staple crops. The evidence from Neolithic sites across the globe is clear. The artifacts associated with food processing, the grinding stones and the pottery shards, are overwhelmingly found in areas of domestic space linked to female activity. This work forged a different kind of power, the power that comes from controlling the transformation of raw nature into cultural life. This deep, practical wisdom was safeguarded and passed down through matrilineal lines from mother to daughter. A young girl would learn from her grandmother which seed varieties were most drought-resistant, which herbs could heal a fever, and how to read the soil's condition just by its feel. This was a living library, an oral tradition that carried the accumulated intelligence of countless generations. In many indigenous American communities, for instance, women were and still are the keepers of specific seed varieties, each with its own story and purpose. They knew that to lose a seed was to lose a chapter of their history and a tool for their future. This system of knowledge transfer created a resilient, decentralized network of expertise. There was no single point of failure, no central authority that could control all agricultural knowledge. It was distributed among the women of the community, making the entire social structure more adaptable and robust. This matrilineal thread wove a crucial principle into the fabric of the farmer's code, the principle that the future depends on the careful, loving transmission of wisdom. Recognizing the central role of women forces us to rewrite the traditional narrative of the agricultural revolution. It was not solely a story of male-dominated domestication of large animals or the construction of irrigation works. It was equally a story of female-led domestication of plants, the invention of food processing technologies, and the creation of a sustainable body of ecological knowledge. The success of this new way of life relied on a partnership, albeit an often unequal one, between the different forms of intelligence and labor contributed by all members of the community. To overlook the female half of this story is to misunderstand the farmer's code itself. It was a code built as much on the patient observation of a plant's life cycle as on the strength to plow a field, as much on the foresight to save a seed as on the authority to command a harvest. This forgotten legacy of female ingenuity is not a minor footnote. It is a central pillar in the forgotten code that built our world, a testament to the quiet, persistent power that truly cultivates civilization from the ground up. A single seed carried in a traveler's pouch could reshape an entire civilization. This was the quiet power of the ancient trade routes, the Silk Roads and maritime paths that connected distant worlds. These were not just channels for silk and spices, they were the planet's first global internet for agricultural data, transmitting living code from one culture to another. A merchant from Persia might barter for Chinese peaches, carrying the pits back to plant in his own orchard. A caravan stopping in a Kashgar oasis would trade Central Asian melons for Indian pepper, each exchange introducing a new flavor, a new possibility into a local diet. This was a biological conversation happening across thousands of miles, a silent revolution in what people grew and what they ate. The hidden rule governing this exchange was not one of simple acquisition, but of relentless adaptation. A variety of wheat that thrived in the Nile Delta would struggle in the cooler, wetter soils of northern Europe. When those seeds arrived, local farmers had to become plant detectives. They observed, they experimented, they saved seeds only from the plants that showed vigor in this strange new land. Through generations of this patient trial and error, they essentially re-domesticated the crop, tailoring it to a completely different set of environmental rules. This process of localization was a brilliant, decentralized form of innovation. It created an incredible diversification of our food supply. The humble apple, originating in the mountains of Kazakhstan, traveled along these routes and was transformed into thousands of distinct local varieties, each adapted to a specific valley, climate, and palate. This was a global safety net being woven in slow motion. If a blight wiped out the primary grain in one region, another, introduced from afar, might offer resistance and save the population from famine. The most dramatic example of this transfer is the story of the potato. When Spanish conquistadors brought it from the Andes to Europe, it was a strange, underground tuber. But it held a miraculous potential. It could feed more people from less land than any traditional European grain. In Ireland, it became a staple, supporting a population boom. But this came with a catastrophic risk, a hidden vulnerability in the very system that had brought it. The Irish came to depend on a single variety of potato. When a blight swept through the monoculture in the 1840s, it had nowhere to hide, leading to devastating famine. This tragedy underscores a dual lesson from the ancient exchange: the incredible benefit of new crops and the profound danger of relying on a lack of diversity. The success of these migrating plants depended on a culture's openness, its willingness to experiment with the foreign and the unfamiliar. It required a mindset of resilience, an understanding that the old ways might need to bend to accommodate a new gift from a distant land. This global network of seeds, moving at the speed of a walking camel or a sailing ship, was ultimately weaving humanity together through the most fundamental of bonds, our shared need for sustenance. Their hands worked the soil with a reverence we have nearly lost. Long before modern environmentalism, the first farmers lived by an ethical code that understood a simple, non-negotiable truth: to harm the earth was to harm themselves. This was not a philosophy written in books, but one etched into daily practice, a deep-seated stewardship passed down through generations. They knew that the land's generosity was not infinite. A field pushed too hard would grow weak, its vitality drained after just a few seasons, so they made the conscious, difficult choice to let it rest. Allowing a field to lie fallow was an act of faith and foresight, a sacrifice of one season's potential yield to ensure the land's health for generations to come. It was a silent promise to the future. This principle of reciprocity extended to the very water they drank and used for irrigation. Communities established strict, unwritten rules against fouling a shared spring or stream. To pollute the water source was an offense against the entire village, a violation of a sacred trust. These were not just practical measures, they were moral imperatives, the hidden rules of a survival code that honored the sources of all life. We can see this sophisticated ecological wisdom perfected in traditions like the Three Sisters, a planting method developed by indigenous peoples across the Americas. They did not simply plant corn, beans, and squash in separate rows. They planted them together in the same mound, creating a miniature, self-sustaining ecosystem. The corn stalk grew tall, providing a natural trellis for the bean vines to climb. The beans, in a beautiful act of natural alchemy, pulled nitrogen from the air and fixed it into the soil, fertilizing the corn and the squash. And the broad, spiky leaves of the squash plant spread across the ground like a living mulch, shading the soil to conserve moisture and suppressing weeds. This was agriculture as a form of symbiosis, a system that nurtured biodiversity and built soil health instead of depleting it. It was a brilliant, tangible expression of the rule that different forms of life, including humanity, are stronger when they work in concert. These ethical principles were often enforced through powerful cultural taboos. A community might hold a belief that overharvesting a particular medicinal plant would anger the forest spirits, bringing misfortune. A taboo against hunting a certain animal during its breeding season was not mere superstition. It was a conservation law wrapped in a story, ensuring the species' survival. These narratives and norms were the glue that held the stewardship code together, making environmental responsibility a matter of communal identity and spiritual consequence. The first farmers were, in essence, our first conservationists. They possessed a profound understanding that their survival was woven into a wider web of life, a balance that required respect and careful maintenance. Their ancient code of land stewardship speaks directly to our most pressing modern crises. It offers a timeless lesson that true prosperity is not about dominating nature, but about learning to live within its wise and generous rules. The first tool was an extension of the human hand, a simple digging stick that leveraged strength to break the hard earth. This humble innovation marked a profound shift from foraging to cultivation, turning exhausting labor into manageable work. Over generations, that stick evolved into the stone-bladed hoe, a tool that allowed a farmer to not just poke the soil, but to truly till it, creating a fine seedbed that gave crops their best chance at life. The true revolution, however, came with the plow. The earliest plows were likely nothing more than a forked branch dragged through the soil, but in the hands of Mesopotamian farmers, this concept was transformed. They harnessed the power of oxen, coupling animal strength to a wooden plowshare. This single invention changed the scale of agriculture forever. A farmer with a plow and a team of oxen could prepare in a day what would have taken a family weeks to dig by hand. This was the hidden rule of leverage, the understanding that human ingenuity could amplify effort far beyond muscle alone. But the Mesopotamians did not stop there. They combined the plow with another brilliant device, the seeder. This was a funnel attached to the plow that guided seeds directly into the freshly cut furrow. As the oxen pulled the plow forward, a worker would steadily pour grain into the funnel, depositing seeds at a consistent depth and spacing. This seeder plow eliminated the wasteful, back-breaking work of bending over to plant each seed by hand. It was a masterstroke of efficiency, a single pass that both prepared the soil and sowed the crop, embodying the farmer's code of maximizing yield while minimizing effort. This tool was not just a piece of wood and metal, it was a physical manifestation of generations of observation, a perfect fusion of timing, motion, and purpose. The next great leap arrived with fire and ore. The advent of metalworking in the Bronze Age gifted farmers with tools that were stronger, sharper, and far more durable. A bronze sickle could harvest a field of grain without losing its edge. A metal-tipped plowshare could cut through tougher soils that would shatter a wooden one. This durability was a form of time saved, a hidden rule of reliability that made the agricultural cycle more predictable and less fraught with tool failure. With metal axes, clearing new land for fields became a more feasible endeavor, allowing villages to expand their territories and support growing populations. The investment in smelting and forging was immense, but the return in agricultural stability was incalculable. Perhaps the most elegant of these early inventions was the Shaduf, a simple irrigation tool that transformed water management. Picture a long pole balanced on a crossbeam like a seesaw. On one end hung a counterweight, often a heavy stone. On the other end, a leather bucket was tied. A farmer could lower the bucket into a canal or river, then use the counterweight's help to effortlessly lift the full bucket and swing it over to irrigate a field. This was the physics of the lever applied to the most vital of resources, water. The Shaduf allowed a single person to lift hundreds of gallons a day, turning previously dry, marginal land into productive gardens. Its rhythmic motion, dipping and rising, became the heartbeat of countless riverside communities, a quiet testament to the power of simple, intelligent design. The creation and use of these tools were governed by another set of hidden social rules. A skilled toolmaker was as vital to the village as the best farmer. His knowledge of which wood had the right spring, how to haft a stone axe head securely, or how to cast a bronze blade was a specialized craft passed down carefully. Access to these advanced implements was often communal. A single seeder plow or a team of oxen might be shared among several families, its use scheduled by the village council to ensure fairness during the critical planting window. This system of shared technology reinforced the community's interdependence. The mastery of implements was never just about owning a better tool. It was about weaving that tool into the social and economic fabric of the village, ensuring that progress in the field benefited the entire community. This relentless practicality, this drive to shape the environment with ever more effective tools, was a fundamental thread in the forgotten code, proving that the human mind was the ultimate agricultural implement. The rhythm of the plow and the shaduf was matched by the rhythm of the drum and the dance. Across the ancient world, the relentless work of farming was punctuated by moments of pure communal joy, moments when the entire village would stop to celebrate the milestones of the agricultural year. These were not random parties, they were vital ceremonies that turned practical necessity into shared cultural memory. When the first green shoots broke through the soil after the long winter, it was not just a botanical event, it was a cause for a festival, a celebration of life's return. The entire community would gather, perhaps sharing a special meal made from the last of the stored grain, now infused with the hope of the new season. This was a powerful psychological reset, a collective sigh of relief that they had survived the lean months and that the cycle was beginning anew. In ancient Celtic lands, the festival of Samhain marked the final harvest and the thinning of the veil between the worlds. It was a time to bring the herds in from the summer pastures, to slaughter animals that would not be kept through the winter, and to gather around great bonfires. This was not just a practical preparation for the cold, it was a sacred acknowledgement of death's role in the cycle of life, a way to honor the past year before entering the darkness of the next. Far to the east, the Chinese Mid-Autumn Festival celebrated the completion of the rice harvest under the glow of the fullest moon of the year. Families would reunite, sharing mooncakes and giving thanks for the abundance they had gathered. The round shape of the moon and the cake symbolized wholeness and family unity, reinforcing the social bonds that the hard work of farming had forged. These festivals embedded hidden rules of gratitude and social cohesion. By stopping to thank the gods or the spirits of the land, the community was reinforcing the principle of reciprocity, the idea that their abundance was a gift that demanded acknowledgement. The feasts themselves were a form of redistribution, ensuring that even the less fortunate shared in the harvest's bounty, at least for a day. These gatherings also served as the internet of their time, a chance for news and gossip to travel, for artisans to display their wares, and for young people from different villages to meet and form new families, strengthening the genetic and social ties across the region. The stories told, the songs sung, and the games played during these festivals were the textbooks of the agricultural code. A child learned the timing of the seasons not from a chart, but from the excitement of the spring planting festival. They learned which plants were sacred from the flowers woven into a harvest wreath. This celebratory layer of the farmer's code transformed the daunting task of survival into a shared cultural experience, weaving work, faith, and community into a single, resilient tapestry. They could taste the health of the land on their tongues. Long before soil testing kits or chemical analysis, the first farmers used their senses as sophisticated diagnostic tools. They would take a handful of earth and feel its texture, rubbing it between their fingers to judge its composition of sand, silt, and clay. Some traditions even held that a farmer could learn the soil's needs by tasting it, detecting a telltale sourness that signaled acidity or a certain alkalinity that suggested it was time to amend the earth. They were reading the landscape with a profound, embodied intelligence, observing which wild plants, which specific weeds, thrived in a particular patch. Lush nettles might indicate rich, nitrogen-heavy soil, while the presence of certain mosses could point to waterlogged, compacted ground that needed better drainage. This was the dawn of empirical soil science, a hidden rule of deep observation that turned every farmer into a practical ecologist. This earthy wisdom was systematically organized into the first soil classifications. Ancient Greek writers like Xenophon and Theophrastus documented these practices, noting that farmers categorized their land into distinct types, from rich, dark loam to thin, gravelly soil. They understood that different earths were suited to different crops, a fundamental concept in agronomy. A heavy clay soil which retained water well might be perfect for their thirsty barley, while a lighter, sandier plot was reserved for vines or olives that demanded excellent drainage. But their genius did not stop at classification. They became masters of soil amendment, actively healing and enriching their land using only what nature provided. They developed the hidden rule of returning nutrients to the earth. Animal manure, both a waste product and a recognized source of vitality, was carefully collected and composted before being spread over the fields. Wood ash from their hearths, rich in potassium, was another prized amendment, used to sweeten acidic soils. They even practiced marling, the laborious process of digging up chalky clay from subsoil and mixing it into the topsoil to adjust its pH and structure. This was targeted farming, a precise intervention based on generations of careful watching. They knew that to continuously take from the soil without giving back was a recipe for exhaustion and famine. This ancient, intuitive understanding of nutrient cycles and pH balance, achieved without a single piece of laboratory glassware, allowed them to farm the same plots for centuries without causing the collapse that often follows modern intensive agriculture. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the most advanced technology is sometimes not a new invention, but a recovered wisdom, a way of seeing the world that recognizes the ground beneath our feet not as dirt, but as a living, breathing partner in the great story of our survival. A sudden drought could erase a generation's work in a single season. The first farmers lived at the mercy of the sky, their entire existence balanced on the precarious edge of weather patterns they could not control. This relationship with climate was not a backdrop to their story. It was the central force that shaped their societies, forging hidden rules of resilience through crisis. In regions blessed with predictability like the Nile Valley, civilization itself was built on a rhythm of flood and retreat. Each year, the river would swell, overflow its banks, and deposit a fresh layer of rich, black silt across the farmland. The Egyptian farmer did not fight this water, they welcomed it. Their entire calendar and their spiritual life were built around this annual gift, developing a sophisticated system of basins to trap and slowly release the floodwaters. This predictable abundance allowed for the rise of a powerful, centralized state, a pharaoh who could command the labor to build pyramids, secure in the knowledge that the river would feed his people. But in other cradles of civilization, the climate was a far more fickle partner. The great cities of the Indus Valley, like Mohenjo-Daro, thrived under the influence of monsoon rains. When the rains came as expected, their advanced urban planning and water management systems functioned perfectly. But when the monsoons failed or shifted, the entire intricate system was thrown into chaos. A prolonged drought meant not just a bad harvest, but the collapse of the trade networks and social contracts that held the city together. The hidden rule here was one of diversification and decentralization. A society dependent on a single, unpredictable climate trigger was incredibly vulnerable. This vulnerability forced the development of remarkable adaptations. In response to persistent drought, farmers in the ancient Near East began a centuries-long project of selective breeding, patiently favoring the seeds of wheat and barley that could survive with less water. They were genetically engineering their crops through observation alone, creating the first drought-resistant strains. Simultaneously, communities built physical defenses against climate's other extreme. The remains of massive levees and diversion canals in Mesopotamia speak to a constant collective battle against floods, a shared understanding that holding back the river was a matter of communal survival. The starkest lesson in climate's power is written in the dust of the Akkadian Empire. Around 4,200 years ago, a sudden, severe mega-drought is believed to have gripped the region. This was not a single bad season, but a climatic shift that lasted for generations, withering fields and emptying granaries. The Akkadian Empire, one of the world's first great empires, fragmented and collapsed under the strain. Its fall is a powerful testament to the fact that no amount of military might or administrative genius can withstand a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between a society and its environment. This historical interplay between climate and agriculture embedded a profound form of risk management into the human psyche. It taught the necessity of flexibility, the wisdom of not putting all your seeds in one basket, and the critical importance of building buffers against the unknown. The first farmers learned to read the signs of a changing world and to adapt their entire way of life in response. Their forgotten code was not one of rigid control, but of dynamic resilience, a lesson etched into the soil by both flood and drought that speaks with urgent clarity to our own time of global climate uncertainty. That first stone placed to mark a boundary was more than a rock. It was a revolution in human thought, a declaration that this piece of earth belonged to someone. With a shift from nomadic life to settled farming, the very concept of land transformed from a shared territory into a measurable, ownable asset. This new reality demanded a new language, a system of rules and measurements to define who could use what and for how long. The earliest property rights were likely simple and familial, with a family claiming a plot passed from parent to child. But as villages grew into towns and towns into kingdoms, these informal agreements evolved into complex legal structures that would shape the course of history. The first surveyors were not officials with sophisticated tools, but farmers themselves using their own bodies as instruments. The Egyptian cubit, for instance, was based on the length of a man's forearm from elbow to fingertip. Using a knotted rope measured in these cubits, communities could divide the fertile land after the Nile's annual flood receded, ensuring each family received a fair and equal strip of the rejuvenated soil. This was a hidden rule of equity, a way to manage a precious communal resource for the benefit of all. But these systems of measurement were never purely about fairness. They were also the foundation of power. In the Roman Empire, the process of centuriation demonstrated this on a breathtaking scale. When the Romans founded a new colony, surveyors would lay out the entire landscape in a perfect grid of squares, each one a centuria, designed to be allocated to veteran soldiers or settlers. This was not just land distribution, it was a powerful act of imposition, stamping Roman order onto the conquered earth and creating a clear, taxable, and controllable landscape. The straight roads and field boundaries we still see in parts of Europe today are the ghosts of this ancient grid. With defined ownership came the inevitable hidden rules of inheritance. In many societies, primogeniture became the standard, the rule that the eldest son inherited the entire family farm. This was not necessarily about favoritism, but about a brutal practicality. It prevented the land from being divided into smaller and smaller, ultimately unsustainable, fragments with each passing generation. This single rule preserved the economic viability of estates, but also cemented social inequality, creating a class of landless younger sons and consolidating wealth and power in the hands of a few. Alongside inheritance grew the concept of tenancy, where those without land could work the fields of those who had it, paying their rent not just in coin, but often with a share of the harvest they had poured their sweat into growing. And where there was ownership and tenancy, the state was never far behind, seeing land as the ultimate source of taxable wealth. The earliest tax records from Mesopotamia are essentially ledgers of grain, calculated based on the size and presumed productivity of a field. This bureaucratic need fueled the advancement of mathematics and writing itself, all to answer a fundamental question born from agriculture. What does each person owe the community or its ruler for the land they use? This institutionalization of space created a deep, lasting paradox. On one hand, the security of knowing a plot was yours to tend and improve fostered incredible investment and care, a sense of belonging that rooted people to a place for generations. On the other hand, it built walls, both real and imagined, between the landowner and the landless, the citizen and the outsider. The farmer's relationship with nature shifted from being a participant in a wild ecosystem to being a manager of a bounded asset. The land was no longer a partner in a sacred cycle, but a commodity to be measured, divided, and passed down. This legacy of the boundary stone is all around us, in every fence line, every property deed, and every map. It is a testament to agriculture's power to not only feed us, but to redefine our most fundamental ideas of space, belonging, and power. That surplus of grain demanded a new kind of memory. In the sun-baked courtyards of Mesopotamian temples, the world's first accountants faced a problem of abundance. How could they possibly remember how much barley each farmer had contributed to the communal granary, or how many jars of oil were owed to the potter? Their solution was to press the end of a reed into a soft clay tablet, creating a simple mark, a permanent record. This was the humble birth of writing, not from poetry or prophecy, but from the practical needs of the farm. The very first written documents in human history are not epic tales, they are receipts and inventory lists. A cuneiform tablet from the city of Uruk, for example, is not a king's decree, but a meticulous account of bread and beer rations for workers. Another records a transaction involving 38 measures of barley. Writing began as the ultimate tool for agricultural accountability. This innovation enforced a new set of hidden rules for society. Suddenly, an agreement was no longer just a spoken promise between neighbors that could be forgotten or disputed. A contract for the sale of a field could be etched into clay, witnessed, and stored. A loan of seed grain to be repaid after the harvest now had written terms. This created a system of transparency and legal obligation that was essential for a complex economy to function. You could not argue with the tablet. It held a permanent, neutral memory of what was agreed upon, protecting both the powerful and the common farmer from false claims. The temple and palace scribes, by recording every basket of grain and every plot of land, were building the first administrative state. Their clay tablets allowed for the management of resources on a scale never before possible, coordinating the labor of thousands and planning for future seasons with precise data. But this power to record also created a lasting divide between those who could read the marks and those who could not, between the literate administrator and the illiterate laborer. The pen, in its earliest form, was indeed mightier than the plow, for it gave humanity the ability to organize its endeavors, to plan across generations, and to finally speak across the centuries. The story of our first fields is written quite literally in the clay. The world's first menu was written not on paper, but in the DNA of a handful of grasses. When our ancestors chose to cultivate wheat, rice, and maize, they were unknowingly selecting the future staples of humanity, narrowing a vast, wild buffet into a concentrated source of calories. This was a nutritional revolution with profound consequences. The forager's diet was wildly diverse, a daily adventure of berries, roots, nuts, and lean game, providing a broad spectrum of vitamins and minerals. The farmer's diet, by contrast, became a predictable routine centered on a few staple grains. This shift provided the steady, storable energy that allowed populations to boom, but it came at a cost. The human body, adapted to a varied forager's palate, now faced a new reality of plenty, but a plenty that was strangely limited. The hidden biological rules began to show themselves. Skeletons from early farming villages often show signs of nutritional stress, with shorter stature and dental problems like cavities and worn enamel, evidence of a coarser, grain-heavy diet. The very abundance that built villages also made them more vulnerable to famine if a single crop failed, and to new diseases that thrived in denser, settled populations. This was the great dietary trade-off, security at the expense of variety. To unlock the power of these new staples, the first farmers had to become the world's first food scientists. A raw grain of wheat is a tough package, its nutrients locked away behind indigestible husks. The invention of grinding stones was a nutritional breakthrough, crushing the grain into flour that the body could actually use. But their genius did not stop there. They discovered the hidden rule of fermentation. A simple mixture of flour and water, left to sit, would mysteriously bubble and rise. This process, the work of wild yeasts and bacteria, not only created leavened bread but also pre-digested the grains, breaking down compounds that could otherwise block the absorption of iron and other vital minerals. In the Americas, the process of nixtamalization transformed maize. They discovered that soaking dried corn in an alkaline solution made from ash or lime unlocked the bound niacin within. Without this crucial preparation step, a diet heavy in plain maize could lead to pellagra, a debilitating disease characterized by skin lesions and dementia. This was not a recipe, it was a survival code, a non-negotiable step passed from mother to daughter that made the staple food safe and nutritious. This new way of eating rewrote the social script of the meal itself. The shared loaf of bread or the communal pot of porridge became powerful symbols of belonging. In the Roman world, the state's distribution of grain to its citizens was a direct political act, a tangible bond between the people and their rulers. The ability to produce a surplus of a single, storable food like rice or wheat created new social hierarchies. The family with the largest grain stores held not just wealth but power and influence. The very rhythm of daily life began to beat to an agricultural tempo, structured around the planting, the harvest, and the daily grind of preparing the staple food. This dietary code, born from the first fields, shaped our bodies, our societies, and our health in ways we are still unraveling. It forces us to ask a difficult question about our own plates. In our modern world of endless choice, have we truly escaped the ancient trade-off between caloric abundance and true nutritional wisdom? Or are we simply living with a new, more complex version of the same fundamental challenge? A deep, unlogged forest was a testament to their faith. Across the ancient world, farming communities deliberately set aside certain groves, springs, and mountains as the sacred homes of gods and spirits. These were not merely places of worship, but the world's first officially protected areas, governed by the hidden rule that some parts of nature must remain forever wild. In ancient Greece, these sacred groves were known as temenos, land cut off from ordinary use and dedicated to a deity. To cut a tree from such a grove was not just a practical offense, it was a profound act of sacrilege, an insult to the divine protector of the community. This spiritual sanction was a powerful and universally understood conservation law, enforced not by human guards, but by the fear of divine retribution. In India, the tradition of sacred groves stretches back thousands of years. These patches of pristine forest, often dedicated to a local goddess or a nature spirit, became incredible reservoirs of biodiversity. While the surrounding landscape was cleared for fields and villages, these groves stood as living libraries of genetic diversity. They protected rare medicinal plants, provided a sanctuary for animals, and most practically safeguarded the watershed. The dense root systems within these groves acted like a giant sponge, absorbing rainfall and releasing it slowly into streams and springs, ensuring a clean, reliable water supply for the very farms that bordered the sacred land. This was spiritual ecology in action, a brilliant system where faith directly supported the community's physical survival. The rule embedded here was one of enlightened self-interest disguised as reverence. By honoring the spirit of the forest, they were unknowingly protecting the complex hydrological cycles and soil stability that their own farms depended on. These groves were also vital classrooms. They were places where elders could teach the young about the interconnectedness of all life, using the sacred trees and animals as symbols of a balance that must not be disturbed. This practice wove a deep-seated environmental ethic into the cultural identity, making conservation a matter of spiritual duty rather than just a practical choice. The legacy of these sacred groves challenges our modern approach to nature preservation. They demonstrate that the most enduring protection often comes not from a government mandate, but from a story that a community tells itself, a narrative that places humanity within nature, not above it. This ancient code of reverence created a sustainable partnership with the wild, a quiet agreement that some ground must never be broken by the plow. Their forgotten code was never just a set of farming instructions. It was a complete philosophy for living, a blueprint for building a civilization in partnership with the natural world. We have traced its hidden rules from the first saved seed to the sacred groves left untouched, from the lunar calendars etched in stone to the complex social contracts forged around shared resources. These principles were not about dominating the earth, but about learning its language and living by its rhythms. They understood that true abundance came from a balance of give and take, from the patience of fallowing fields and the foresight of saving diverse seeds. Their legacy is not merely in the food we eat, but in the very structure of our communities, our concepts of time and ownership, and our enduring search for meaning. The challenges we face today, from climate uncertainty to food system fragility, are not entirely new. They are the consequences of forgetting parts of this ancient code. The first farmers teach us that resilience is found in diversity, not in monoculture. They show us that sustainability is a practice of reciprocity, of giving back to the soil and the water as much as we take. They remind us that our survival has always been a collective endeavor, dependent on shared knowledge and communal trust. Their wisdom whispers to us across the millennia, asking us to look at our own world with the same attentive eyes. What seeds are we saving for the future? How are we nurturing the health of our land and water? In what ways can we rebuild the bonds of community that make us resilient in the face of uncertainty? The answers are not lost. They are waiting in the patterns they left behind, in the quiet, persistent logic of the farmer's code. If this journey into the roots of our world has sparked a new perspective for you, we would love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments which part of this forgotten code resonates most with you. And if you are hungry for more mysteries from our shared past, subscribe to keep exploring. The story of humanity is still being written, and as we face an uncertain future, we may find that our greatest innovations are not ahead of us, but are waiting to be rediscovered in the deep, fertile soil of our